Alrighty, everybody. Hi, I'm Dr. Boz, and welcome to Sunday night. Thank you for joining me. I am going to actually go over to this screen where I can see your comments and just say thanks for joining me tonight. It is Sunday night here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and I had a really good show for you, but I changed my topic here about 24 hours ago, when my mother, who many of you know, was admitted to the ICU, the locked unit with no visitors, because she has been COVID positive. So we're going to tell you a story about her health, and I think you're going to really like the show, but it wasn't what I was planning, and we'll talk about the health of your mitochondria a different week. Thank you for everybody that is chiming in, that the sound is good and the camera is all set up. It is actually on my new computer, and I don't have Jack, who's been helping me with some of the technical stuff and just being my right-hand man to just, help me make it a little easier. So thanks for chiming in. It's really good to see some of the regulars out there. I could go on for listing several of you, but just thank you for joining me. I'm going to start out with some of the typical traditions, which is checking my numbers and then doing a little bit of a recap of what we're going to do tonight. So I'm going to tell you a story about Grandma Rose, who's my mother. We affectionately call her Grandma Rose. And I want to carefully say that this is not a place for your medical advice. This is how I have treated my mom. And although there may be some parallels to the story, it does not substitute for your own doctor on how you might be needing personalized medical care attention. So use this as a great source of education, but it is not medical advice. All right, the technical details are out of the way. All right, we're just going to check some ketones and glucose here. And I am going to tell you that last week I set a challenge of trying to have a can of sardines every day. And I think I made it that like the first meal of every day was going to be, there's my, can I see that? There we go. There's my ketones and there's my glucose. Maybe I didn't sleep so well last night. Boy, that looks way funky tonight. Maybe it's just my computer, but does that look like iridescent on everybody else's camera? Anyway, those are the numbers, 1.1 and 101 for my glucose. Haven't eaten since noon, so I'm probably 6 hours fasted, but did not sleep well last night, and which is a big factor in how well your glucose turns out. We'll check these numbers again at the end of the hour, just kind of showing you that I am real. And in the spirit of keeping it real, I will tell you that my sardine challenge failed. So when you succeed, we can all celebrate, but when you try something and you don't quite make it, it's actually just as educational to say what happened there. I am going to mix up some BHB to drink during the show, and just to kind of give you some expectations that this is the one of the 3 BHB salts that I put together so that I could be confident of what's in it, but also that I tell my patients, if you are going to take these really expensive supplements with beta-hydroxybutyrate in them, please, please, please do what I'm about to do, which is test to prove that the ketones in your blood go up when you swallow them. Let's finish the thought on that sardine challenge. So I'm not giving up. I just didn't succeed for 7 days straight. So I was trying to have my first meal of the day be a can of sardines, and I made it 3 days. Was it 3 days or 4 days? If you go back on Instagram, you can see I had a sardine week and I was progressing through it, and then I stopped because I stopped eating sardines. So as with any goal that you set a little too high or in a way that you don't reach the goal, I'm going to show you what I do and what I recommend patients do. You'll also see this theme coming through in several of the things I used with my mom and her health, and in the courses that I teach or in the healthcare that I advise. Is set a goal. If you don't quite make the goal, we're going to set a little lower goal and see if we can reach that one. So I'm still going to try to have sardines as my first meal of the day. And when I do that, I'll try to announce it. I'll like make that a thing because I do think I need to eat more fish in my diet, and I'm not very good at eating sardines. So I made it 3.5 days, 3 or 4 days, I can't remember. But in any event, it wasn't 7. I'm going to try again, and stay tuned on that. One more announcement. My little sister's birthday is today, so if you put a big shout out to happy birthday, Peggy. We've had a really stressful weekend with Mom's rush to the hospital, at which point we all are locked out and haven't seen her, but get to text her and get phone calls from her. So I actually hope she's watching. So this is for you, Mom. I'm going to recap your story and tell you why I have lots of hope that at 76 years old, with both lungs having a pneumonia and a severe amount of fluid in your lungs, I think you're going to be okay. And we're going to go through why you have done absolutely everything possible to give your chances of survival from this the highest outcome. Ooh, I have goosebumps. I'm going to not get emotional. All right, so let's just adjust this camera just a little bit. Jack would tell me not to do that live, but okay, so let's just do a little recap of Grandma Rose. So those of you that are new to the channel, you might not know that this whole adventure of being on YouTube was not in my dreams of how am I going to do my medical career. I'm an internal medicine physician, and my mom, who we affectionately call Grandma Rose, had struggled with CLL, or chronic lymphocytic leukemia, kind of a cancer of the white blood cells, for over a decade. She was 71 years old, and I am her daughter, internal medicine physician, made sure she had the best of care, went to nearly every oncology appointment, did my best to chaperone what was being done in her care. She had the best care medicine could offer. But in 2015, a good 5 years ago now, she had big lymph nodes back. We knew she was due for another round of chemo, and the 2 previous rounds of chemo were awful on her. Her cancer is of the white blood cells, but this is going to be very important in a few minutes when I explain what it is that she's at risk for. But specifically, her cancer is in that section of the white blood cells that is your first defense, known as your T cells. But her cancer just says they are offline, don't depend on them, they don't work very well. So it makes her body and her system very vulnerable for viruses. In fact, about 10 years ago now, is that about right? She got West Nile virus. So she got bit by a mosquito. And again, mosquitoes are going to transmit that West Nile virus through the skin when they bite you. And that's right where your T cells are supposed to do their job. And if your T cells have cancer, that little virus got all the way to her brain. So she had West Nile meningitis before she ever had a symptom. I mean, she had a little headache. The day before, she had a holy Hannah, I can't move. We're in the hospital in Mitchell, South Dakota for 10 days saying, we don't think we can life flight her anywhere. Every time we move her, her blood pressure drops. So that was Grandma Rose's first big lesson in what happens when CLL lives in your white blood cells, is you become very vulnerable when viruses come into your body. And West Nile spanked her life. It was awful. She is my lovely mother, and I think made every one of my pieces of clothing until I was 10. But she got home from West Nile, and her brain had been so swollen that she didn't know how to use a sewing machine. And I think she was born using a sewing machine. So since then, she recovered, but that was a tough test. And then this story comes about, and I'm going to pull the book without ruining my microphone here. This is the book that I wrote that I wasn't expecting the world to read, but thank God it has been shared. And you can see that picture on the front of the book where she's about 50 pounds heavier than she is now. It's actually on a chemo day where my youngest son is giving her a kiss, saying, Mom, Grandma, don't let that cancer win. You know, she had all the reasons in the world that she wanted to fight this cancer. And that day in 2015, we walk into the oncology office and she's done. She has had chemo a couple of times. She says, if the doctor says chemotherapy, I want you to know that the clothes I want at my funeral are in that closet in the basement on the top shelf. And I'm like, we're going to talk about this now? In walks the doctor. And of course he says chemo. And we walk out of that appointment with a pink slip to a choice point, and we were standing in the hallway where one hall led to her place to schedule the chemotherapy, and the other hallway led to the front door. And I ask her, Mom, do you trust me? And she flippantly says, of course I trust you. And I said, no, with your whole life, do you trust me? And she gets a little, she kind of gets taken aback, and she says, of course I do, why? And I said, let me show you what I would do if it was me. If I was 71 years old with cancer of your white blood cells, let me show you what I would do. And that was a very dangerous thing to do. I had no idea if her cancer of the white blood cells was glucose dependent. I had no idea if we were going to be able to make what I had read in the literature about a ketogenic state and cancer improve her ability to not just withstand chemotherapy, but to fight off this cancer. Anyway, as I taught my mom over the next few months, I wrote these little lessons for her, like these very basic rules of how do you implement a ketogenic diet. And so I'd write a little chapter about what's going on in Grandma's world. Then I'd write the little science lesson. And that's what the book is. And I really put the book together almost as a memoir at the behest of my husband, who kept saying, you should turn that into a book. You should turn that into a book. And I'm like, I'm not a writer. I don't do that. Anyway, the punchline was the book is her story of about an 18-month period where she went from kind of a zombie, a brain that was not working well, and white blood cells that were clearly not working well, to a time where her health was challenged very severely. She actually fasted for 40 days during this. This was far into the book. But truly think this approach of using the ketogenic nutrition while using Western medicine, it saved her life. I know it did. And then she's been on this journey with me. So I'm going to just show you one more picture for the book before I put it back up there, and that's the one on the back cover. And this is the picture the week that the book was printed. I don't know if you can see that, but she's 50 pounds lighter, and I think she's probably 20 pounds lighter than what she was here. And again, not about weight loss for a cancer patient, but she is much healthier. And that process of dealing with some other things that came her way as her health deteriorated or had a stress has been powerful to not just improve her journey through a hiccup with her cancer, but to truly increase the quality of her life. So that's how this YouTube channel started. I took those little lessons and I put them all in a video series. And if you go to the playlist on this channel called All Things Keto, it's a beginner's playlist of all these little lessons I gave my mom that I turned into short video clips for how do you start? You know, like, don't get lost in the weeds. How do you start? So what started out as just getting her healthy enough to take chemotherapy again turned into over almost a year and a half before we ever needed chemotherapy again. And her health has never been better. And of course, as an internal medicine, I couldn't believe the things I was studying and now intensely researching, not just to help my mom, but to weave that approach of a very advanced ketogenic nutrition into my clinic. So as I progress through this, Grandma Rose does pretty well. Many of you know that she had a pretty big tax on her life the last year, while my dad, who had a problem with leaking protein out of his kidneys. That kidney function took about 20% of his kidney function away over the last 5 or 6 years. We never could figure out what was causing it. Probably some sort of autoimmune problem within his kidney. Anyway, his kidney stopped working over a year ago, and Mom helped him do home dialysis. He passed away earlier this year, just about 2.5 months into the COVID mess. And so the stress of just being that primary caretaker at 76 years old was also part of her journey. Which brings me to what I want to talk about tonight, which is my mom got COVID. And what did I do for my mom's very vulnerable medical condition to prepare that if she got COVID, which I think all of us are going to get it or be exposed to it, and whether you get it before or after a vaccine, you don't have much control over. You have some control, but really, I think it's almost, I mean, you can be as careful as Grandma Rose was being and still end up with an infection. So what did I do in my mom's situation, and then what do I do in my family to help us say, how can we increase the chances that this 76-year-old woman who has a cancer that is very much linked to her white blood cells and the line of defense that is in charge, the first line of defense in charge of a virus, it still is dysfunctional. Those cells just don't work right. Now the cancer is way low, and maybe there's a few good T cells out there helping her, but we don't know that. In fact, when she got West Nile, the team of infectious disease and oncology studied exactly what was wrong with her type of white blood cells. CLL is kind of a broader group of cancer of the white blood cells, but specific to Grandma Rose, we knew that her T cells, that first line of defense, that was the one that was most impacted by her cancer. So we had that information, and now we have COVID sweeping through the country. And my adorable 76-year-old mother lives 100 miles away from a hospital. She's on our family farm without Grandpa, has done some pretty awesome things in the last 5 months of being a widow. She's YouTubed how to run a skid loader. That was very funny, but she did it. She's also just, run the maintenance of the farm. So she's living her life, doing a good job, serving with her church, part of the community thrift store that they have in this little town of 800 that she really likes, and she's living her life. But in that process, we knew that increased her risk of exposure. We can't lock her in a box forever. The farm is very isolated. The whole state of South Dakota is pretty isolated. But what are we going to do for a 76-year-old who's got an immune system with a specific problem that the T cells didn't work? So let me explain to you, in the world of COVID, but also several infections, of why those T cells are super important. So I wonder in the comments if you could put, has anybody out there had kids that got infected, or they had a parent that got infected, but you're pretty strongly, you've got strong keto nutrition, or you're really healthy. You've got normal blood sugars, you've got no chronic inflammation, you do not have high blood pressure, you do not have any type of heart disease, you do not have metabolic syndrome, your body mass index is normal. I'm trying to put all the list of it here because people say, oh, I'm healthy. And I take one look at them to say, you're overweight, sir. That's not healthy, and it's not good for your white blood cells. So I'm trying to put the criteria. What do I mean that you're healthy? I would say that I'm healthy, but I probably wasn't in 2015. I had more weight. I had not as good a sleep. I still push really hard, but I pushed really hard and didn't recover very well. I even had some swelling that would happen in my legs when I would get really tired. So those were signs that there was inflammation inside my body. And if a virus comes into my body in that state of high inflammation, my T cells are in charge of it. But I want in the comments for you to say, have you had anybody out there that's pretty healthy, yet come in contact with coronavirus and didn't test positive? The specific test that I want you to comment on is whether the antibody test stayed negative in your case. And that antibody test is really important, but in the sequence of what happens in our bodies, a virus will come into our system, and that first line of defense is the T cells that will try to encapsulate that virus and get rid of it before it ever gets to the defensive cells that make antibodies. So there's this opportunity that we have really healthy, robust systems that come in contact with viruses, and then they never make antibodies to those viruses because their line of T cells are so strong. This is also part of the information that's out that is from Wuhan, China, where they have blood samples of T cells and their you don't want to call them antibodies, but the markers within a T cell from 2015 to 2017. So it's called COVID-19 because it was discovered in 2019. So when there's blood samples before that that have a match to SARS-2 and COVID-19, I mean, it matches to COVID-19 or it seems to cross-react with that, those are the T cells that are doing that. So when if you're kind of a geek about this and hear that there is some sort of built-in immunity, it's through those T cells that your body is doing that. Well, Grandma Rose doesn't have those. So after Grandpa's funeral and the coronavirus became a much, it was always pretty big, but she had a doctor's appointment, and we got to have some alone time to say, all right, we need to really buckle down to prepare that the chances you're going to get this infection are very high. Now, at the same time, she'd had a little bit of a rise in she had a warning sign in her report for her cancer. Not so much a rise in her white count, but that the space inside her bone marrow, where you make white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets, two of the three, the ones that don't have cancer, were lowering enough that it makes us concerned that her bone marrow has some scar tissue in it. And so we talked about saying, all right, if you look at what we can do, because we can't go in and scrape out your bone marrow, you're too old for a bone marrow transplant, you do have the best immune system you've had in probably 20 years, meaning before her cancer started, she's really that healthy now. But there's a warning sign that she really does need to ignite some autophagy inside her bone marrow. So we put her through a challenge and in the same process had a conversation to say, not only will this help your body spark some autophagy and maybe open up some space in that bone marrow for your red blood cells and your platelets, but it will improve your body's immunity over the next few months if you can just take your health to the next level. So I'm going to do a side note here. Let's see if I can do this. I think it's this one. Yeah. Okay. So this Keto Continuum is the platform for what I used on my online course, and is the outline really for what I'm doing for the book that I'm writing. But I want you to notice that Grandma Rose didn't hang out in the area that was a little bit a little bit ketogenic. We have lots of people that write into the office saying, I've been keto for 6 months and I haven't lost any weight. I've stalled out on the keto diet. I have this problem and it's not getting better. How can I increase the intensity for my results with a ketogenic diet? So that whole answer is in the online course that is, if you go to bozmd.com/shop. I thought that was at the bottom of my screen, but it's not. Try that. There you go. You can find the course online and know that it is the most succinct lessons I could put together for beginning to end of how do you become as ketogenic as Grandma Rose? How do you take the ketogenic nutrition to a calculatable process that, I know my sweet mother is in a ICU right now. I can't see her. I haven't seen her in this whole story. She's in a locked unit that only the medical providers that have privileges to that unit can go in and out of the unit. But I need my mom to know that she's going to be okay. And even if God says this is her time where she's not going to be okay, she needs to know that we did absolutely the best things we could do to a 76-year-old immune system with T cells that are dysfunctional in the setting of a pandemic of a virus. And it's because she didn't hang out in this first few steps of having of the keto continuum. That keto continuum is divided into 12 steps, but the first 4 are the beginner's phase of the keto continuum. And again, I go through this very thoroughly, very succinctly in that online course, but the book that I'm writing and the workbook will also be a way that you can use this to work through, hopefully with your physician, as a workbook and another person's story on using the keto continuum. So here's this beginning level, which says they're beginners, and many people get to that keto adapted phase, and they even might limit their meals to 2 meals per day. But I needed Grandma Rose to live at one of the baseline metabolisms, which is what I ask. Oopsie daisy, don't want to do that. No. There we go. I need Grandma Rose to live at one of the baseline metabolisms, which has to do with either time-restricted eating of 16-8, meaning divided the 24 hours that you only eat during those 8 hours. And she really did live around that. Maybe she wasn't always 23 and 1, but probably 22 and 2. She would eat in a 2-hour window. And she was really good about not doing like her daughter does, which I frequently at the end of a fast will have a celebration meal. But she lived in her baseline metabolism. And when we had this conversation about 4 months ago saying, not only do we need to ignite some autophagy in your body, not only do we need to get some more space in that bone marrow, but there's this pandemic and your specific cancer does not fight off the first wave. You don't have the T cells to give yourself that defense. So much like what happened with West Nile, the virus will get much deeper into your body before you ever have a symptom. And indeed, that's really what happened, that she said, I don't feel well on Thursday. She went into the little local clinic there in our town and they did a chest x-ray and I saw it online. It looked just fine. Her oxygen level gave me a little hint that there was something up because she's usually 98 or 99% on her pulse oximeter. She was at 94. She didn't have a fever. And in fact, the medical team said she just looks so healthy for her age and having this cancer. But that little virus got past her T cells, and by Friday, she got saturations in the mid 80s, and she actually it was high 80s at that point. But she had some oxygen from Grandpa's leftover tools, put on a little oxygen, had a nebulizer. Her sats went back up into the 90s. But she woke up on Saturday, and that's where this was not good. She needed to be rushed to the hospital, and within a few hours ended up with positive pressure because her lungs on both sides had a pneumonia. And her lungs, whether that's from this virus or something else, I'm not sure yet. But it's also got about 1/3 of each lung had filled with fluid. And that's a very dangerous place metabolically. That the oxygen's low, 86 or 76 years old, and an immune system that isn't going to warn you until things are dividing inside your lungs. So what Grandma Rose has been doing for the last 4 months is she's been touching and stressing her metabolism with a 72-hour fast. Now, if you follow online, and if you're one of the best parts about this course is you get to be inside a private neurons group, which have all taken the course and really do follow this process like what Grandma Rose did. And again, it's not medical advice, but they are saying here's what I'm doing. I want a little support. Anybody want to do this with me? So as Grandma Rose has been doing these 72-hour fasts, several people throughout the neurons group did it with her. And boy, it was so encouraging. She did I didn't succeed on that. I got a few 72-hour fasting with her, but nope, it was not, the timing was not right, and I just failed. I didn't do it. Kind of like the tuna thing, or sardine thing. But she had, in the last probably 4 months, her white blood cells got a really strong workout. When doing a 72-hour fast, there's the best video I've ever done, and I still think it's the best one, is the last video in that online course talks about what happens in a 72-hour fast when they've been ketogenic nutrition for the past 2 months, for the past 3 months. So they're really strong metabolism, not just because they think so. They have documented numbers that they are really strong metabolism. And then they push a 72-hour fast. And it is fascinating. It's my favorite lecture. But that's what we asked Grandma Rose to do. We said, you know what? We need that autophagy for the space in your bone marrow, and we need your immune system to be as healthy as possible. So she's been doing a 72-hour fast once a week for the better part of, I think we're in the third or fourth month of her doing this. And then that leads to, whenever her 72-hour fast was done, then she'd go back to her baseline metabolism, which was somewhere around that 22 hours a day she didn't eat, and 2 hours a day she would eat. If she had some struggles, she would sip on a few little BHB, the ketones in a can that I like to call them, or she would have some bone broth. The other things that we did for Grandma Rose is I went through very carefully the evidence on how K2D3 is the one vitamin that I recommend. And like I've said before, I don't have any of these supplements that I don't use in my family or for me. And it is the only vitamin I will ever, I think you should be able to get most of your nutrients from healthy sourced whole foods. But K2D3 is the exception, and especially to what the evidence was on when a viral infection came into a body. Even if their vitamin D was low, those who were supplementing had less symptoms, had less severe symptoms from COVID or from influenza. And those studies are over the last 6 months, a very helpful process as a physician to say, it feels like we can do nothing, right? This virus is coming, we're going to get this. We don't have any control over when this vaccine comes out. But I also contend that I don't want my mom depending on what that vaccination is going to do. She is somebody who the vaccination will probably be very helpful for because of that role in her immune system, that the antibodies sitting and being present are going to be the first line of defense for her. She doesn't have T cells there. The rest of us, the people who have functional T cells, we should be able to at least give a good all-American slug to that virus when it enters our body through our T cells. The next layer of defense is for your antibodies to be readily made, accurately made to fight off this virus. But much like influenza, the unknowns of this are, if we get that antibody correct for this first wave, will it be the same thing for the next go around or not? And instead of focusing on socially distancing and wearing her mask, which she does, she also took it upon herself and under my care to get her immune system as strong as possible. And I had no expectations on Thursday when she wasn't feeling well, but the report from her local doctor was a good x-ray, a little bit lower on her oxygen level, but no other signs of a coronavirus syndrome, that it would come back positive 48 hours later, and that she would deteriorate with a whopper of a response. So I have a couple of stories about Grandma Rose that have happened that I think are super funny because it's her. So she gets rushed to the hospital, and again, it's a place where you can't have family around, or then I will have to close down my world, which I'm willing to do. But if I don't need to, I'm gonna say, let's try to do this without having me rush up to the hospital. And of course, if I get exposed, then my kids have to stay home from school. And South Dakota is one of the few places where we have real live children going to real live classrooms with real live teachers. And I don't want to put them at risk. So she enters the hospital, and she's very concerned about some of the complications that happened in that book. And one of them was a situation where she had been really strongly ketogenic. And in fact, this was the part of the story where she got quite sick to the point where she was fasting for almost 40 days. And finally, something happened, and she got rushed to the hospital, and they put an IV in her, which is normal, but inside the IV, they put sugar water. Now, she'd been ketogenic. She'd had a blood sugar in the 70s and 80s most of the time. And then these well-intended physicians and medical teams rushed a whole bunch of sugar molecules into her. And within 24 hours, her face and body swelled up so much that she couldn't open her eyes. She looked like a marshmallow. I mean, I'm like, that can't be my mother hidden behind all of that fluid. Like, I don't know how it didn't then end up in her lung that time. I'm sure it did, but she was so swollen, it was just painful to look at her. It was like she'd been in a car accident and everything was just morphed together. So as she goes into the emergency room, she's watching very carefully that does not happen again. So she gets out of the ER without any glucose in her IV, and she gets up to her room, and she has her glucometer with her. And the nurse says, "Well, I'm about to hook you up. You haven't had any calories today, and we're going to have to put some sugar in your system." And she's like, "Oh no, you won't." She says, so she texts me and says, "What do I do?" I said, "Well, the nurse is out of the room, and what do I do?" I'm like, "Well, grab that glucometer and check your sugar, and when the nurse comes back in, you show him, see, my sugar is very stable and well controlled, and I do that with diet, and if you put that sugar in my vein, we're going to have a problem." So she definitely says her piece, and she practices a little bit, and she's kind of short of breath, so her little chunky sentences deliver the message that you are not going to put that sugar in me. So then it becomes a thing, because now you're like going against what the doctor wants. And she's like, "We can check my blood sugar, and anytime it drops below 50, you can think about sugar, but it's not going to do that. I check it." She was really adamant. So the other thing that Grandma Rose had been doing when she didn't feel well is she has, during her cancer treatment, one of the places, this was after the book was written, but now her cancer had gotten worse and she was going to need chemotherapy. She was on a ketogenic journey, but this got to a critical point. And we looked at other ways that we could help her body fight this cancer. And one of those was a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. Again, 100 miles away is where the closest one was. So for the first week, she drove 100 miles each way to do hyperbaric oxygen treatments. And then we found one that you can have a portable one in your home. So she invested in that, and it's at her house. So she gets in the chamber this last few days when her breathing wasn't working so well. And again, that's a really smart idea. So that positive pressure probably helped push that fluid out of her lungs, and just gave her a little bit more space and time in this story. So she gets to the hospital, and she's won her little battle against the blood sugar, and but then at about 10 o'clock late last night, the code team, the rapid response team, ends up in her room because her saturations are down into the 70s. She's now been about 12 hours away from her hyperbaric oxygen chamber, so the fluid probably migrated its way back in to her lungs, and now she's in her the oxygen's in her 70s. Her heart's racing. She's very stressed. I'm not near her, and I'm on speakerphone listening to a room of people do exactly what I know they should be doing, but incredibly difficult to listen to say, I wish I could be there, Mom. So they get this positive pressure on her. For those of you that know what a CPAP is, it's a pressured air system, which is kind of like blowing air in your nose and mouth. But much like the hyperbaric oxygen, it's going to push air out. And as she was breathing, trying to kind of keep the oxygen where it should be, now she's got this strong pressure in her face. And it did help. Within a few minutes, her oxygen saturations were up. But it's an awful thing to wear. It's very uncomfortable, but it's saving her life. So she makes it till about 5 o'clock in the morning, and her sats are pretty good. And she finally gets that thing off and says, there's got to be a hyperbaric oxygen chamber around here. Who's the guy that runs that? So she asked to talk to him. And the nurse had never heard of that idea. She didn't know any. I don't know if it was a he or she at that time. There was a couple nurses. And she goes, yeah, I told the nurse all about it. She was educating the nurse on how useful hyperbaric oxygen chambers can be. And I want to talk to one. There's got to be one in this hospital. And indeed there was. And they came in and put on that personal protective gear and came and talked to Grandma Rose to say, we're sorry, because you're COVID positive, you would be the only one in the hospital who would get to use it. We're only allowing patients who are COVID negative to be able to use it. And I completely understand the resources need to go to the place they need to. And but God bless her for saying, well, here's what's worked, is you're not going to put sugar in my veins. And you can give me all this steroids and remdesivir and all your experimental things, but I still want my hyperbaric oxygen chamber. So God bless you, Mom. It is a useful idea, and your spirit is nothing but endearing to me. But the last thing I wanted to share about was how stressed she got when, and she was texting me saying, honey, my blood sugar this morning was 120. And I said, that's a good thing, Mom. Which is totally contrary to what we've been talking about for the last 5 years now. Is her Grandma Rose, that keto continuum is not just a theory in Grandma Rose's life, but when she first started out and really was in those beginning stages of really advancing her metabolism, her sugars were in the 90s, maybe even over 100. And as she has really progressed into this area of metabolism, her morning fasting sugars are now in the 60s and 70s, where they should be. Now, it did not happen overnight. It took probably 3 years to get her sugars in those 70s routinely, and especially to see how well she controls her sugars during a fast has been just, it's a wonderful reassurance to me that we're doing the best options of nutrition and healthcare and health in a time where she can't afford to have inflammation in the way of her outcome. So when she wakes up today, and she's proven to the medical team that she doesn't need any sugar water, so she's checking her sugars, and she's like, I did it again a few hours later, and it was up to 140. And I'm like, no, Mom, that actually is a good thing. And I couldn't speak to her. I just did a little texting. So this is for you, Mom, on why would I say that, oh, her sugar is elevated and that's a good thing? And the answer is they gave her steroids. So we know that taking steroids will decrease inflammation. And we depend on that in our COVID patients, that it is a huge part of the equation to just rapidly stop the inflammation that's going on in their body. If you have chronic inflammation, if you have metabolic syndrome, when they talk about having this pre-existing condition that increases their risk, it is those people whose sugars hang out in the 90s. It takes much more insulin to keep that sugar controlled. And when insulin is high, ketones are low. So again, looking at all those equations together can be a little mind-blowing. I've simplified this to the Dr. Boz ratio, which takes your glucose divided by your ketones, And Mom's goal was at least to get her Dr. Boz ratio under 40 over the last year, and especially in her 72-hour fast, we were really hoping she reached a Dr. Boz ratio of less than 20. And what is that saying? That's saying that her blood glucose is controlled, and by controlled I mean healthy in her 60s and 70s, and that her ketones would rise to deliver the kind of energy her body needed. So this 1 unit, do a ratio and kind of know that the lower it is, the less inflammation you have. The lower it is, the better you're stimulating that mitochondria to work, and the closer you are to being able to confidently know you have autophagy, or cellular turnover of those weaker parts in your cells. So Grandma Rose did a good job of that over the last few months, and she has been in a ketogenic state, not a theoretic ketogenic state. She's been using ketogenic nutrition and checking her numbers to prove that she has keto chemistry working for her. And now that I need it to be perfect, I need her body to be robustly responding to this prescription medication. When you look at the response of glucose that starts out at 90 and then shoots up to 250 or whatever it is that, you can look at the response of what glucose does. We want her glucose to respond because it's not used to seeing that. We don't want her glucose to shoot up to 300. We don't want it to shoot up to 250. That's very damaging to your brain, actually. It swells up a lot of cellular parts. We do want it to rise. We want the body to have a response to that steroid. And in essence, there is a lack of your body having that chronic inflammatory cortisol or high stress state, which is what happens when people are overweight for long periods of time. Add cancer to that, add fatigue to that, add the death of your husband to that. But during all that, her ability to keep her ketones pretty robust and her glucose well controlled has allowed her system that when we give her a steroid dose, it responds exactly as we want it to. It rises. We need that to happen in order for her inflammation to be reduced. And it didn't overshoot to a level that's going to be inflammatory and very it overshoots the need for not just the steroid, but it overshoots the goal for what that steroid was supposed to do. So Mom, that elevated glucose is also another reason you can tell your medical team that you do not need the extra glucose in your IV. You're perfectly capable of using this advanced metabolism that we have been working out your mitochondria for the better part of 5 years, but we've really been intensely exercising your mitochondria since Dad's funeral for the last 4 months. And I believe with my whole heart that you're going to get out of that hospital, that your immune system is going to respond, that you are as prepared as we can possibly be to have both lungs have a pneumonia, to have a whole bunch of fluid in your lungs where they don't belong. But we have done, you've done it. You've done everything possible to get through this. I love you, Mom. All right, let's take your questions. So I'm going to quick take a drink here while I look through. Just to ask, I'm looking for some questions about, you can have infection and keto, or you can have, I'll take any questions that come along. It is about 10 minutes to the top of the hour, and we're going to try to take the last 10 minutes to give us at least a couple of questions with answers. So let's take a look at some of these questions. Let's see here. Yeah, so somebody remarked about hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin and whether or not they work. Here's the part that I tell my patients is, no matter what antibiotic I choose for you in whatever situation, I'm only, in the best of systems, going to improve your immune system by about 30%. So you still have the bulk of the responsibility of a healthy system. I host this weekly ketogenic group where I answer questions, again, not giving medical advice, but answering their questions about the ketogenic journey. And we look at the immune systems that go haywire, called autoimmune, and watching to see that when infection comes into their systems, they have so much of their body putting energy into just attacking their own cells that the infections seem to come into their bodies more often. And when they do come in, much like Grandma Rose, their immune system has just got too many battles going on at once to perform that perfectly. As a result, they have more infections and they end up on things like steroids, which decrease, I don't mean steroids for like an acute infection like what Grandma Rose is dealing with right now, but I mean they're on steroids long term. And unfortunately, that weakens their white blood cells even further. So the 70% that is needed for you to do your part and then medical teams to do our part, the strength of that is, what are your other chronic illnesses? Do you have high blood pressure? Do you have are you overweight? Do you have high insulin, but probably don't know it? And neither does your doctor because we don't test that. And those processes make it very difficult. So even though hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, yes, they've got some studies that say in certain populations, especially the timing of that was very important. But more importantly, I remind people, just like I don't want my mom waiting for a vaccine before she could leave her house. I wanted her getting her immune system as beautiful and as accurate and as robust as possible before a vaccine came out. I mean, we don't have any control over the vaccine, but we do have a control. Within 48 hours, you can change your white blood cells. It comes with lowering the insulin in your body, and that is, what is your Dr. Boz ratio? Again, if you don't know what some of these terms are, the fastest way to get from where Grandma Rose started out before I wrote that book to this level of education is to take that online course. You can peck around YouTube and find a lot of the answers. It'll just take you a lot longer. So let's see if there's a couple other questions. Are there any groups for keto and fasting that are women over 60? Well, I don't know, but if you look at that neurons group, there's a lot of women in that group over 60 that they follow that keto continuum. So that's the one I pay attention to, and I try to help coaches. How would I coach my patient? How would I use this situation? So I haven't looked for other ones. Sorry. Let's see. So there's a good question. Tammy says, if you test positive for COVID-19 antibodies, does it mean that you can't get it again? So my kids have asked me this too, because in their schools in South Dakota, we have done, just want to praise South Dakota school systems for keeping the governance of whether or not your school is open to the local school boards. That's such a big deal for our democracy. I really appreciate that we get to weigh in on whether or not our kids are going to school. And we get the consequences. When they get sick and when we get sick, we know that this is us. But my kids asked me the other day if you have a positive antibody test, you don't have to self-quarantine. You've already been infected and you're not likely to spread the virus. Now they all wear masks every moment of school, and they socially distance. And anyway, so the answer to that is, in your local area, the chances that the migration of that virus is going to switch and change within a short order is probably not very likely. When it comes to, can I guarantee that for the rest of the life of COVID? Like many viruses, they do, the way they're so witty, the way they're so powerful is they mutate. And we already know that if you just look at the DNA strings of these COVID infections throughout the globe, we have several strains bubbling in different communities. So to say, if you get it once, are you never going to get it again? I wouldn't say never. I would say that the chances you're going to get it again in your local community this season is you're probably pretty protected. But your T cells, it's a different story. So strong T cells, which means don't have metabolic syndrome, don't be overweight, don't have high blood pressure, don't have high triglycerides, don't have a big fat tummy, don't have a thick neck. There's a couple other ones I'm forgetting. Essentially, don't have prediabetes. let's see. There's a couple of other questions that we can take, and okay, so here's a good question. So Cam says, doing a 16-8 fast for almost 2 weeks. So 16-8, I would encourage you to say a 16-8 time-restricted eating. I will tell you that only because fasting we like to look at as you go beyond 24 hours. So if you only eat 1 meal a day, it's still time-restricted eating. If you have 16-8, it's time-restricted eating. Fasting actually is correlated to some improvement in your growth hormone, improvement in norepinephrine, and it probably doesn't happen very robustly, maybe a little bit on a 16-8. Although it's a great place to live, it's wonderful. So you've been doing 16-8 for almost 2 weeks. During the fasting period, I feel the keto flu. Once I eat, it goes away. And he's like, how can you avoid this? And the answer he actually wrote in his little comment too is it's almost always related to the salt. Again, salt is this demon that we've talked about that, oh, you need to have a low salt diet. That's what's going to make your blood pressure go down. That swelling in your in your ankles or in your lower extremities is because you have too much salt. No, you got to have salt inside your circulation to pull fluid back out of that third space or the space between cells and back into circulation. And salt also is what keeps that blood pressure stable. However, it is the flow of salt that really is what should be talked about. You add a bunch of salt, you can see people swell up. If you add it only once. What you want to happen is a steady supply of salt being added to your diet. And there are plenty of studies out there that talk about the constant regulation of salt is very important. I've done a few videos on, somebody mentioned it, Soleil water, S-O-L, and then E with a, it's not a tilde, an accent over it. Soleil water is a glass jar with a big salt crystal in it, and you fill it full of distilled water, and then you use that salt water. I put it in my coffee, which sounds really weird, but I love it. And you're trying to get just a little bit of salt in everything. But the mineralized salt tends to just be a much better compliance. Real salt is where I get my big salt crystals. If you go to bozmd.com/Dr. Boz Favorites, or just go to bozmd.com and click on Dr. Boz Favorites, you'll see that I am looking at there's a bag full of a bunch of rocks. So I say, there's one of them where I'm licking the rock, but it's actually better to put it in the bag, and there's quite a few minerals in there. There's a couple of links in that area to show you the analysis of what's in Redmond salt. And again, I underappreciated how big of a deal this was until I really was struggling to get back into doing 72-hour fasts again. And as soon as I added the salt in, I've really been successful. All right, well, we are almost to the top of the hour, so I'm going to check my numbers before I go. And again, say thank you for those who have I hope what you appreciated, or that you appreciated, that this process of taking care of my mother, again, is one of the nearest and dearest patients in my life. And her advice might not fit with your world, but should never be carried out without your doctor knowing about it. So take notice of, there we go. Take notice of what your doctor has to say about this, and hopefully you found it educational in what I do with my family. The other thing I didn't talk about was what I do with my family. Oh, I didn't circle back to that. I have it right there in my notes too. So the number one thing that my kids are required to do in the morning and at night is take K2D3. Yeah, so my ketones went up to 1.6, my glucose came down to 91, and I didn't spend a lot of time talking about what happens when beta-hydroxybutyrate is circulating. I mean, it isn't going to go over and destroy that virus, but there are a lot of metabolic advances that happen when your body has a strong supply of ketones and that glucose is controlled. Now, it's late at night here, it's 7 o'clock, and my glucose is 91. First thing in the morning, I want my glucose to be around that 70, 65, 75 range. That's perfect. I often don't hit perfect if I'm not fasting. So I know last week I did the sardine thing and I skipped my fast, so I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to fast, and then I'm going to try to have sardines as the first meal of the day that I eat as a rule, and see if I can get 4 cans in a week. So we'll see how I do. Once again, thank you for everybody who prayed for Grandma Rose and has been watching but my social media and praying for her. It is incredibly comforting to have such a strong support group and be showered by prayers and affection for what is incredibly difficult to stand back and watch. So one more question RT just put in, is K2D3 twice a day? I know I keep this one twice a day. I have my kids take 2 in the morning, 2 at night, and until this COVID stuff is over, they don't get food if they don't do this. Like, this is a really big deal. So usually you just need 2 capsules a day, but I've upped the dose for them. It's still far below the recommended daily, but that'll be enough to keep them protected, and vitamin D is a big deal. So, all right, that's enough. God bless you. I'm Dr. Boz, improving your health one ketone at a time. We will see you next week, everybody.